Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Nation of Nations, a story of America after the 1965 immigration law, by Tom Gjelten. Narrated by David Colacci. The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. In the history of the earth hitherto, the largest and most stirring appear tame and orderly to their ampler largeness and stir. Here at last is something in the doings of man that corresponds with the broadcast doings of the day and night. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Walt Whitman. Preface to Leaves of Grass. Prologue. The family farm sat on the edge of a pristine glacial lake in Norway's fjord country, in a sparsely settled district known as Ardal, which was therefore the family name. Behind the barn, a dirt trail led up a valley into the mountains. The hillsides were steep and rocky, but the soil was fertile and well watered by glacial runoff. In the summer, cattle and sheep grazed on the verdant slopes. The Ardal family named it Sunghildtunet, Sunghild's place, after one of the early Ardal women. The property had been in the family as far back as 1759, passing from father to firstborn son according to the ancient primogeniture law that guaranteed continued family ownership of Norway's farmland. By 1864, Sunghildtunet should rightfully have passed to Johannes, but he was just 22 and restless, and the prospect of following the familiar path of his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather left little to his imagination. In Norway he faced a predictable future, and not an easy one. For all its natural beauty, Sunghildtunet would never be a farm that yielded abundance. The winter was long and dark and cold. To stay there would be to settle for the narrow 19th-century world of the Norwegian peasantry. His forefathers had no choice, but Johannes did. The talk in Ardal in those days was of going to America, a country wide open to Norwegian immigrants. From towns on the west coast, ships were sailing daily to Bergen or Liverpool or other transatlantic embarkation points. For the equivalent of about $30, companies offered special America packages, covering steamship travel across the ocean, plus rail transport into the U.S. interior. Large tracts of tillable land, so scarce in Norway, stood empty in Wisconsin and Minnesota and the Dakota Territory. Dreaming of new lives in a different land, Johannes and his 20-year-old wife, Britta, said goodbye to their families and headed across the Atlantic. With Johannes abandoning his claim, the farm in Ardal passed to the next oldest son, Ole. There were two other sons in the family, however, Samuel and a second Ole, and when they reached adulthood a few years later, they had no land of their own and nowhere to find work. Norway in the 19th century had one of the highest rates of population growth in Europe, but it still had a pre-industrial agrarian economy that offered few employment opportunities. More than two-thirds of the population lived in rural areas, the majority of them landless. The Ardal brothers knew what they needed to do, and in the spring of 1875 they sailed to Liverpool. From there they booked passage to America on the Allen steamship line, a route favored in those years by tens of thousands of Norwegians. In each decade from 1860 to 1910, the country lost about 5% and sometimes more of its population to emigration. Only Italy and Ireland lost proportionally more. The vast majority left rural Norway and made their way to the rural United States. The Norwegian-American writer Ole Rolvag called it the Great Settling, and in his novel, Giants in the Earth, he painted a vivid portrait of the Norwegian immigrants' experience as they fanned across the upper Midwest. They traversed the plains in covered wagons, towed by oxen that would later be put to use plowing fields or hauling timber. The wagons were packed with the things they would need to start a frontier life: household utensils, farm implements, clothing, bedding. Samuel and Ole made their way to western Minnesota, where their brother Johannes had homesteaded a decade earlier. By the time his younger brothers showed up in June of 1875, Johannes had an established farming operation, and he immediately put Samuel and Ole to work. After the harvest season, Samuel and Ole found work in the area as laborers, hiring out to whoever needed help. During the winter, when farm work was scarce, they attended public school, grown men sitting alongside 9- and 10-year-olds in order to learn English. Once they had saved enough money to buy some livestock and a wagon, Samuel and Ole moved on to look for land of their own. They headed first toward the Red River Valley in the northeast corner of Dakota Territory. It was a slow journey. The cattle they brought with them were constantly hungry and kept stopping to graze along the way. Nearing the Red River, they found the plain almost entirely flooded and had to wade through the water and muck. Mosquitoes tormented them. Most of the land they had crossed had already been settled, so they pressed on to the west, where there was still acreage free for the taking. The southern part of Dakota featured abundant grassland, but the Ardal brothers, having grown up among fjords and mountains, were not drawn to wide-open spaces, so they stayed to the north. As they plodded on, they encountered fewer and fewer sod shacks, until at last they reached territory no one else had claimed. The land had not been surveyed yet, and Samuel and Ole could take it simply by driving stakes into the ground and declaring it theirs. The terrain was somewhat reminiscent of rural Norway, but this was virgin land. Everything Samuel and Ole built, they built by hand. Most of the work they did for the first time. Ingenuity and enterprise were key. For their first shelter, they turned their wagon box upside down and mounted it on 4 posts, laying the canvas over the top. Next, they built rudimentary log cabins. After stripping the logs, they stacked them one atop another, filling the spaces between with clay from the riverbed. The roof was made of bark and sod, laid carefully across pole rafters. In Norway, the farm life had been ritualized, consisting of chores done the same way generation after generation. In America, the sod Samuel and Ole opened with their plows had never been broken before. The land had never been planted, the fields never fenced. The whole venture was exhilarating. This was the Norwegian immigrant experience that inspired Rolvag. As Per Hansa lay there dreaming of the future, it seemed to him that hidden springs of energy, hitherto unsuspected even by himself, were welling up in his heart. He felt as if his strength were inexhaustible. Success in America for immigrants required looking ahead and focusing on what had been gained, not what was left behind. The Ardal brothers would never see Norway again. They had year-round farming responsibilities and soon were raising families. The old country was impossibly far away. Inevitably, the immigrant experience included periods of loneliness, especially acute there on the Great Plains. But Norwegians were known for their stoicism. Pious Lutherans and not given to frivolity, the brothers worked hard and skillfully and prospered in their new farming lives, cultivating wheat, oats, and potatoes. They dutifully came to see themselves as Americans, but it was not hard. No one marginalized them as newcomers, challenged their presence on the land, or questioned their loyalty, identity, or religion. With other local immigrants, they built schools and churches. As pioneers, they took that part of America as their own, and no one questioned their claim. Back in Norway, the emigration continued. In 1883, Samuel and Ole's sister Britta left with her husband, Tollef, and joined her brothers in North Dakota. In 1900, their nephew Nikolai followed, 36 years after his uncle Johannes had blazed the trail. He had also lost the Sunghildtunet inheritance to an older brother. Like the others, he headed to North Dakota and worked for his relatives, attending a one-room country school to learn English. But the farming life was not a good fit, and Nikolai opted for business school, eventually finding work at a bank in the town of Milton. There he met and wed a young schoolteacher named Bessie, the daughter of an immigrant from England. Their marriage produced 5 children, among them my mother. The country my ancestors chose as their new home had a political culture that grew largely from the pattern of its settlement. In Europe, the people came with the territory, but in America the territory came first, and those arriving from other lands became American citizens by swearing allegiance to the new nation and the individualist ideology on which it was founded. They must look forward to their posterity rather than backward to their ancestors, John Quincy Adams said of the immigrants. By coming to America, they could assume a new national identity based on their adherence to a creed and a set of values. To outsiders, the American character was shaped on the frontier, where rewards came in return for effort and enterprise. The French travel writer and historian Alexis de Tocqueville, having visited the United States in 1831, was struck by the egalitarianism of American life, which he largely attributed to the country being a new and unbounded place, where people coming from foreign lands could start over all on the same basis. It was a country where the inhabitants arrived but as yesterday upon the soil which they now occupy, and brought neither customs nor traditions with them there. As Adams had noted a decade earlier, the separate genealogies that had channeled people into the old world into one or another future were irrelevant in America. Class differences mattered little, because the abundance of opportunity produced a degree of social mobility in America unmatched anywhere else in the world. Instead of deferring to authority, Americans learned to be self-reliant. As no signs of incontestable greatness or superiority are perceived in any one of them, they are constantly brought back to their own reason as the most obvious and proximate source of truth, Tocqueville wrote. Comparing America to other countries he knew, he found it unique in almost every way. The position of the Americans is quite exceptional, he concluded. Thus arose the American myth that would inspire people around the world desperate for a chance to prove themselves in a new land. The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, George Washington had famously declared, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. No country on the planet would be as associated ideologically with immigration as the United States. The foreigners who broke ties with their old countries, pursued new opportunities in this different land, and were willing to be judged on their own merits and achievement, personified the model American. This was said to be the nation of new beginnings, where people could be defined, in the words of immigration historian Oscar Handlin, not by virtue of common descent, but rather of common destiny. The experience of my own Norwegian relatives matched the idealized version of the immigrant story. America was indeed the place where their ambitions were limited only by their own talents, will, and discipline. After becoming a bank officer, my grandfather Nikolai lost almost everything in the 1930s, but his faith in his adopted nation and his pride in what he had become were unbroken. To the very end of his life, he wore a white shirt and necktie 7 days a week, every day of the year. It was not some carryover of an old-world custom. In Norway, he was raised on a farm. If anything, his dress served to highlight his break from his own rural background. On a return visit to Sunghildtunet at the age of 84, his relatives took a picture of him sitting on a hayrake behind a horse, dressed even there in a shirt and tie. It was as if to show he belonged at a desk in his North Dakota bank, not in a hayfield in Norway. For most of the world's population, however, the American immigrant promise was hollow. In reality, it was limited to people of the same skin color as my Scandinavian ancestors. Despite George Washington's lofty declaration, the first immigration law passed by Congress in 1790 offered U.S. citizenship only to free white persons. The foreigners who settled in the United States over the first 200 years of its history were from Europe, and almost nowhere else, except for those Africans who came as slaves or were born into slave families, and they had to struggle mightily to gain membership in the nation. Almost everyone else was limited by poverty or circumstance from moving to the United States, or they were barred under U.S. law from coming at all. Thousands of Chinese, almost entirely men, were admitted in the middle years of the 19th century, but only as contract laborers, and with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, Chinese immigration was officially prohibited. The more people wanted to move to America, the more difficult it became to obtain American citizenship. Even those coming from Southern and Eastern Europe found they were unwelcome. The Harvard-trained lawyer Prescott Hall, co-founder of the influential Immigration Restriction League, posed the critical question in 1897. Do we want this country to be peopled by British, German, and Scandinavian stock, historically free, energetic, progressive, or by Slav, Latin, and Asiatic races, historically downtrodden, atavistic, and stagnant? So much for the Tocquevillian idea that America's immigrant history promoted an egalitarian and individualist political culture, supported creativity and enterprise, and produced this new nation where one's ancestry did not matter. In the view of the immigration restrictionists, it was not the liberating and energizing experience of venturing across the ocean and into an unfamiliar environment that led my North Dakota forebears to prosper. Rather, they achieved what they did simply because they were Norwegian. That view was reflected in a 1924 law that allocated immigration slots on the basis of the candidate's national origins and effectively excluded most Asians from citizenship. The thrust of the legislation was reinforced with the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952. Each of the Asian, African, and Middle Eastern countries was allocated barely 100 immigrant visas per year, while Germany, the United Kingdom, and other countries of Northern and Western Europe each received thousands of reserved slots. The evident premise of U.S. immigration law was that the explanation for America's success in the world actually lay in its European heritage, not in its history as a country shaped by enterprising newcomers. It was only after 1965 that the United States unconditionally embraced its immigrant character, and it did so unintentionally. The 1965 amendments to existing law effectively ended the allocation of immigrant visas on the basis of national origin, putting applicants from around the world on a mostly equal basis. The reforms coincided with dramatic changes in the global order. In newly prospering Europe, economic and social pressures were no longer pushing people to seek new opportunities abroad. At the same time, the developing countries were experiencing population growth, rising aspirations, and heightened conflict. In those regions, more and more people wanted to leave, and improved communication and transportation, across the whole world and not just the Atlantic Ocean, facilitated their migration. So they came, in far greater numbers than the legislators of 1965 had anticipated. In the next 50 years, the percentage of the U.S. population born outside the country tripled and shifted dramatically in composition, with immigrants arriving from Vietnam, Korea, India, Pakistan, Egypt, Mexico, Central America, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and many other places previously unrepresented. Their experiences were not so different from those of my Norwegian ancestors. They came because opportunities were lacking in their own countries, and they were attracted by what America offered. Like the immigrants of a century earlier, they took risks and were rewarded for their perseverance and initiative. The obstacles they faced, on the other hand, were bigger than anything their predecessors encountered. These new immigrants could not disappear easily into a white Euro-American society, no matter how hard they tried. Language barriers sometimes kept them isolated. Even their ideas about God, family, and work could set them apart. Devout Muslims stood out in particular. In this alien environment, some immigrants would experience rejection and a disappointment that cut even deeper than the pain that drove them to leave home in the first place. Others discovered that hard work and ambition could actually lead somewhere in this country. The immigrant influx set up a belated test of America's character and identity. Was its strength and resilience a result of its formation as not merely a nation but a teeming nation of nations, as Walt Whitman said? Or were its achievements actually due to its Anglo-Saxon heritage? That aspect of American society was fast diminishing in relative importance, replaced by an unprecedented racial and ethnic diversity. The country had not yet dared to see whether it could live up to its motto, e pluribus unum, out of many, one, an expression that referred originally to the 13 colonies coming together as one state. At last, America could find out whether it was truly an exceptional nation and what it really meant to be American. The story unfolded with particular drama in some communities, like one suburban county in northern Virginia that experienced a lifetime of change in a few short years, as immigrants arrived from all sides of the world with experiences the local old-timers never could have imagined. Some were poor, some came from professional families. All were enterprising, and together their lives represented the experience of a diversifying nation. Part 1. 1. Two families from Korea. The second time Jung-jae fled Seoul, she left her son Pong-suk behind. They had escaped together when North Korean forces captured the city 6 months earlier, and then returned as soon as U.S. and South Korean forces took it back. But in January 1951, the North Koreans crossed the Han River again, and this time was far more frightening. Jung-jae was certain that Pong-suk would be grabbed, if not by the Communists, then by the South Korean troops who were conscripting every able-bodied man they could get their hands on. Her husband had died in 1936, and Jung-jae depended on her 22-year-old son too much to risk losing him. An elder in her church, who had vowed to remain in Seoul despite the Communist advance, said he would protect Pong-suk by hiding him in the basement of the pharmacy he owned, and Jung-jae felt she had no choice but to trust him. "Don't move," she told Pong-suk on the first day she left Seoul, accompanied only by her 14-year-old daughter, Nam-soo. An older daughter was with relatives in another province. "We'll be back," she said. "Just wait here for us." It was the last time she saw Pong-suk. By then, the only way out of Seoul was on a single freight train headed to Busan, the port city about 300 miles to the southeast at the tip of the Korean peninsula. There would be no more trains after this one, and desperate residents were fighting to get aboard. Jung-jae, 50 years old, and Nam-soo managed to climb on top of a boxcar and claim a small space open to the elements. They stayed there all the way to Busan, huddled with others in the January cold, buffeted by wind and rain and snow, with only a single blanket for the two of them. Some of the people crowded around them developed frostbite or hypothermia. Some fell off the train. Some froze to death. Jung-jae and Nam-soo, clinging tightly to each other for 3 days and 2 nights, somehow survived the trip, and in Busan they found relatives willing to take them in. But the trip had taken its toll. 5 months later, weakened by her ordeal on the train and sickened by guilt and anxiety over her decision to leave Pong-suk to his fate in Seoul, Jung-jae suffered a heart attack and died, not knowing what had become of her son. The pharmacist had hidden Pong-suk well. The North Koreans did not find him during their 3-month reoccupation of Seoul, and he was not detected till the day U.S. forces showed up at the pharmacy looking for medicine. Not understanding English and unable to determine what the Americans wanted, the pharmacist reluctantly called Pong-suk out from his hiding place to help him communicate. Pong-suk had studied English in school and was somewhat able to interpret. Impressed by his language ability and much in need of Korean speakers to assist in the war effort, the Americans conscripted him on the spot and took him away with them to work as an interpreter at a U.S. base in Daegu, about 70 miles northwest of Busan. Several months later, on a weekend leave, Pong-suk went to Busan to locate his mother and his sister. It fell to Nam-soo, now 15 years old and alone, to tell her brother that their mother had died. Recalling the moment more than 60 years later, she could not stop crying. Heartsick, Pong-suk returned to Daegu to work with the U.S. military for the duration of the war, but he vowed to leave Korea the first chance he got. "I hate this country," he told Nam-soo the next time he saw her. "Everything I loved is gone. I never want to see Korea again." With his fluency in English and his experience working with the American military, Pong-suk qualified for a scholarship to study in the United States and received a student visa. He left Korea on a boat in 1954 with no intention of ever going back. His scholarship took him to Simpson College, a 4-year institution in the small town of Indianola, Iowa. It was hardly a place where he could feel at home, but Pong-suk was thrilled by the opportunity. With his visa to enter the United States in the 1950s, he was in a select Korean group of senior government officials, students, war brides, and some Korean military personnel who had been associated with U.S. forces during the war or were pursuing additional military training in the United States. Outside those special categories, it was nearly impossible for Koreans to immigrate. Before leaving, Pong-suk told Nam-soo and his other sister, Soon-sung, that he wanted them to join him. "As soon as I get to America and get settled down, I will find a way for you to come," he promised. But they knew it was unlikely. Pong-suk did eventually manage to line up a Simpson College scholarship for Nam-soo, but getting her a visa was likely to be a challenge, and in any case, there was no money for her to make the trip. After the war, Nam-soo returned to Seoul and reunited with Soon-sung, who was 15 years older and had an 8-year-old daughter of her own. Soon-sung's husband had died before the war, and she and Nam-soo were both penniless, a condition they shared with many others in Seoul. Much of the housing had been destroyed, and after 3 years of war, a quarter of the population was homeless. The two sisters and Soon-sung's daughter found space in a shelter run by their church and lived there with other women. It could have been much worse. Of the 300,000 South Korean women who lost their husbands during the war, many were left with their children to wander the streets of Seoul or across the Korean countryside scrounging for food. Such conditions lingered for years. By 1960, the annual per capita income in South Korea was still below $100, comparable to the poorest countries in Africa. Nam-soo was able to get a low-paying job as a clerk in a government office, but her older sister, having to care for her daughter, was able only to do some work at the church where the women had taken shelter. When the three of them left the church, it was only to share a single room they had rented in someone else's house. Their brother, Pong-suk, meanwhile, was thriving. A student of economics, he was able to continue his education at Yale University, and he successfully petitioned the U.S. government to have his immigrant status adjusted to that of a permanent resident, qualifying him later for citizenship. He married a fellow student, also Korean, and in a rare letter to his sisters in Seoul, Pong-suk enclosed a picture of himself and his young bride. They kept it and looked at it often to remind themselves that dreams sometimes come true. "We have a brother in America," Nam-soo would tell her friends. "That could be my life, too." Arranged marriages were common in rural Korea at the time, but the union of Lee Jeom-chul and Seong-nak-man in 1957 was nevertheless notable for the way it was thrust upon the young couple without any consideration of their wishes. The father of the groom and the father of the bride, occasional drinking buddies in the village of Jimshil, were both practical men. "Hey, you have a daughter, don't you?" Not.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?